Welcome back to the briefing. There are two numbers that define the moment when a military campaign planned for a quick surgical victory transforms into an existential trap, replicating the worst American strategic disaster of the 20th century. And those numbers are 10,000 and 80. 10,000 is the amount of new combatants the United States urgently sent to the region, preparing for a suicidal ground invasion. 80 is the percentage of Iranian ballistic missiles that penetrate Israeli defenses, hitting their targets. 10,000 fresh troops mobilizing toward a quagmire. 80% defensive penetration, proving technological supremacy, is an illusion. And as that apocalyptic convergence materializes, the Trump administration is trapped in the LBJ syndrome, where it knows it is losing but cannot politically withdraw. Let that sink in, because this is not about a war where one side needs reinforcements to eventually win. It is about the moment when leadership repeats exactly the same pattern as Lyndon Johnson in March 1965 in Vietnam, sending ground troops into a conflict that air power alone cannot win, knowing that the decision condemns thousands of soldiers to death in an asymmetric quagmire. The air campaign since February 28th failed to produce regime change. Hormuz remains closed. Now the only option is to escalate to boots on the ground or admit complete defeat. Trump chose Vietnam. Stay with me, because this is not about numbers where 10,000 seems like a manageable reinforcement. It is about the convergence of 5 realities that make a ground invasion not just difficult, but guaranteed operational suicide. Reality 1, the 82nd Airborne Division, 2,000 soldiers, plus 5,000 Marines loaded onto the USS Iwo Jima and USS Boxer, amphibious giants. Reality 2, Netanyahu mobilized 400,000 soldiers to annex southern Lebanon and conduct a multi-front war. Reality 3, Iranian ballistic missiles penetrate Israeli defenses at 80%. 10 out of 8 break through Iron Dome and THAAD, hitting their targets. Reality 4, asymmetric desalination. Iran has a 2% dependence on desalinated water. Kuwait, 90. Qatar and Bahrain, 80 to 90. Saudi Arabia and Oman, 60 to 70. Reality 5, 175 girls and female teachers burned alive in a school by a second wave of attacks. 10,000 new combatants, 82nd Airborne, 2,000, 5,000 Marines. Elite paratroopers and amphibious assault Marines signal an offensive invasion. The 82nd deploys rapidly via parachute. Marines specialize in coastal assaults from the sea. The combination indicates the capture of hostile territory through simultaneous airborne and amphibious insertion. USS Iwo Jima and Boxer, Wasp-class amphibious assault ships, 40,000 tons each. They transport 2,000 Marines with armored vehicles and attack helicopters, projecting force from the sea onto a hostile coast. 2 simultaneously to the Gulf signals an amphibious invasion on a scale not seen since the Pacific in World War II. Netanyahu, 400,000 mobilized. Israel has a population of 9 million. 400,000 is 5% of the entire population. Total war. Not a limited operation, but an entire society committed to an existential conflict, annexing southern Lebanon up to the Litani River while fighting Hezbollah in the north, Hamas in the south, and Iranian pressure in the center. The IDF is on the verge of collapse under sustained multi-front pressure. 80% penetration, 10 Iranian missiles launched, 8 break through defenses and hit targets. Iron Dome and THAAD are designed to intercept threats. 80% penetration means the systems cannot handle the volume, speed, and sophistication of the Iranian attacks. Defensive superiority is an illusion when the adversary saturates and exceeds interceptor capacity. Asymmetric desalination. Iran, 2% desalinated water. Kuwait, 90. Qatar and Bahrain, 80 to 90. Saudi Arabia and Oman, 60 to 70. Attacking desalination plants has a radically asymmetric impact. Destroying Kuwait's kills the country in days. Destroying Iran's is a minor inconvenience. Iran demonstrated a willingness to cross a red line by attacking a Kuwaiti plant. The message is clear. If the United States attacks Iranian civilian infrastructure, Iran turns the entire Gulf into an uninhabitable desert through mass thirst. 175 girls and teachers burned alive. A school attacked. The first wave damages the building. The second hits the evacuation. 175 burned alive. A war crime with no international consequence establishes the precedent that civilian infrastructure and schools are legitimate targets. 12th century Crusade doctrine. Pope Innocent III, rhetoric of civilian destruction and the wrath of God. American military leadership uses medieval religious language to justify modern war crimes. Munitions reserves at critical minimum. The American arsenal is depleted. When reserves fall to a critical level, the capacity to defend forces and respond to contingencies is severely degraded. You don't sustain two major conflicts when you've exhausted munitions in one. China watches empty arsenals and calculates a window in the Pacific. Russia sees the degradation and recalculates in Europe. Fake successful negotiations. Trump proclaims progress in Iran talks. Totally fabricated. The objective is to manipulate financial markets. The administration lies about negotiations to inflate stock markets. Investors make decisions based on false information. When the truth emerges, the collapse is more severe. Mercenary force for Netanyahu. A war not authorized by the US Congress. Designed for Netanyahu's interests. The American military functions as a mercenary force for a foreign state. The military of a superpower deployed pursuing the objectives of a foreign government without domestic legislative authorization turns the national armed forces into private contractors for a foreign power. The LBJ syndrome. March 1965, Johnson knew Vietnam was unwinnable but could not withdraw politically. Domestic ratings depended on projecting strength. He escalated by sending troops, knowing he would condemn thousands to death in a quagmire. Trump faces exactly the same trap. He knows an invasion is suicide, but admitting defeat destroys his presidency. He escalates toward disaster because the alternative is immediate political humiliation. Trump psychologically unstable. He blames NATO for not helping. He favors suicidal scenarios like capturing Karg with paratroopers. The leadership blames allies for a unilateral decision, pursues commando operations it considers unviable. You observe the collapse of rational decisions under unsustainable pressure. IDF on the verge of collapse. Hezbollah pressing from the north. Hamas from the south. Iran in the center. Israeli forces fighting on three fronts with no ability to concentrate power. An army dispersed defending multiple fronts, none defended adequately. Collapse is a matter of time under multi-front pressure. Israel lobby controls the media. TikTok, CBS, CNN under the influence of the Israeli lobby prevents the formation of a domestic American anti-war movement. A foreign power controls major media platforms, suppressing dissent against a war that benefits the foreign power. Informational sovereignty is compromised. The population does not form an informed opinion when information is filtered by foreign interests. NATO fragmenting after 80 years. Spain completely closed its airspace to American military aircraft. When a NATO member denies air access during an American military operation, the alliance is functionally dead. 80 years of Atlantic cooperation ending, not because of an external threat, but because of European rejection of unilateral American military adventurism. Europe making individual security decisions. European states concluding that collective security through NATO does not work. Each nation must ensure its defense independently. When allies abandon collective security in favor of individual national arrangements, the post-World War II Western security architecture is disintegrating. Iran's patience and attrition, waiting for the United States to make the fatal mistake of a ground invasion. It demonstrated its willingness to cross red lines by attacking the Kuwaiti desalination plant. The message is that if Iranian civilian infrastructure is attacked, the entire Gulf will be turned into a death zone through the destruction of the water supply. Millions would die of thirst in days when desalination plants are destroyed in a region that depends 90% on desalinated water. Iwo Jima and Boxer in narrow waters is suicide. The Persian Gulf is a geographic trap, shallow, narrow waters. Giant amphibious ships are easy targets for coastal ballistic missiles, drone swarms, and submarine mines. When you put 40,000-ton ships into waters where the adversary has complete coastal defense advantage, you are sending them to the ocean floor. There is no evasive maneuver in a confined space. 82nd by parachute and helicopters to Karg is direct slaughter. Karg Island is small and heavily defended. Paratroopers landing are massacred immediately by defensive fire. Helicopters are shot down by man-portable anti-aircraft missiles. When you insert airborne troops into a highly hostile environment without the ability to establish local air superiority, you are sending them to an execution, not a combat operation. Gulf desalination destroyed means millions have days of thirst. Kuwait is 90% dependent. Qatar and Bahrain, 80 to 90. If Iran destroys the plants in response to an American attack on Iranian civilian infrastructure, the Gulf countries have days before the population dies massively of dehydration. There are not enough water reserves. There is no rapid import capacity. Death is a matter of days, not weeks. Exponential, inevitable nuclear weaponization. When a regime faces existential destruction through a bombing campaign that ignores international law, the incentive to obtain the ultimate nuclear weapon becomes overwhelming. Iran will accelerate its nuclear program as the only guarantee of survival. When an adversary concludes that the only way to prevent annihilation is a nuclear weapon, proliferation becomes inevitable regardless of agreements or sanctions. Hormuz, total standstill. The Gulf legal system faces irreversible collapse. Since the invasion of Poland in 1939 by Hitler, the system of international law built post-World War II is collapsing irreversibly. When a superpower ignores the UN Security Council and attacks sovereign states unilaterally, the rules-based order ends. It is replaced by the law of the jungle where power determines the outcome, not the law. 10,000, 80%. 2,082nd, 5,000 Marines, Iwo Jima, Boxer. 400,000 Netanyahu multi-front. Iran 2, Kuwait 90. Asymmetric desalination. 175 burned alive. Munitions critical. Fake negotiations markets. Mercenary Netanyahu. LBJ knows he's losing. Won't withdraw. Trump unstable. Blames NATO. Karg suicide. IDF collapse 3 fronts. Lobby TikTok CBS CNN suppresses anti-war. Spain closed. NATO 80 dies. Europe individual security. Iran patience. Kuwait plant red line. Iwo Jima Boxer geographic trap bottom. 82nd Karg direct slaughter. Gulf plants millions days thirst. Nuclear inevitable exponential. Hormuz total. Poland 39 legal irreversible. What happens when 10,000 head toward a quagmire knowing Vietnam is repeating? What happens when 80% penetrate, proving technological illusion? What happens when 400,000 total existential war? What happens when 2 versus 90 asymmetry kills countries in days? What happens when 175 with no consequence medieval? What happens when critical arsenal degrades contingencies? What happens when lies collapse markets worse? What happens when national mercenary for foreign? What happens when a syndrome condemns thousands to a quagmire? What happens when unstable blames and pursues the unviable? What happens when multiple fronts collapse over time? What happens when informational sovereignty is compromised? What happens when 80 years of cooperation ends over adventurism? What happens when collective decides individually? What happens when patience waits for the fatal? What happens when geographic easy targets? What happens when insertion is execution? What happens when 90 destroyed means days of thirst? What happens when existential accelerates nuclear? What happens when Poland legal jungle? You are in a war where 10,000 knowing repeats, where 80 illusion, where 400 total, where 290 kills days, where 175 medieval, where critical arsenal, where lies collapse, where foreign mercenary, where syndrome quagmire, where unstable unviable, where multiple collapse, where sovereignty compromised, where 80 adventurism, where collective individual, where patience fatal, where geographic easy, where insertion execution, where 90 thirst, where existential nuclear, and where Poland jungle.